Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and today I want to give you a quick convention report because I've just come back from Arisia 2024. So Arisia is the big science fiction, fantasy, comic book, nerd convention in Boston. And my wife and I go every year, although this is the first time we've been back in person since 2020, just before the pandemic started. So we were super excited to get back to the convention. We love the vibe. We love going to the panels and all the events and just seeing all the costumes. And so we try and get a room there and stay in the hotel and do the whole weekend. And we just love the show. The first time we went to Arisia was on our third date, so it's very important to us. Also, just as part of our story. So we just love going back to Arisia every year. So we're really excited to finally get back to Arisia, and we had a great time. Show is definitely a lot smaller than it used to be. There's just was sort of a confluence of bad events that happened where basically a couple years before the pandemic, they had a big issue with the hotel. That was a big mess. They ended up having to move venues to a smaller venue, and so like the last year that was at the main venue, they had it was their biggest year ever. It was like 4,600 people. The new hotel they moved to couldn't accommodate as many people, and so the attendance dropped quite a bit to only like 2,800. So they lost quite a few people. There was also some issues with the people running the convention. The chairperson or whatever was accused of some unsavory behavior. I don't know all the details, but a lot of people stopped coming to the show because of that. The convention organizers pretty quickly kicked out everyone that was involved in any of the things, as far as I understand. Again, I'm not that familiar with the details, but anyway, because of that, there's again more people left, and then the pandemic hit. So the upshot of all of this is the show is a lot smaller than it used to be. Again, the first couple of years we were there, it was like 4,500 people, 4,800 people. This year, I don't know what the figures were for this year, but last year, which is the first year they had it back in person after the pandemic, there's only 1,400. I'm guessing it was probably similar this year. So, it's only about a third of the size of what it used to be, but still a lot of fun. You mainly see that in the common spaces, right? When you're actually in like the panels or in the game room or the art show or whatever, it mostly seems the same. There's still the same attendance, whatever. It's just when you're wandering around the hotel, there's far fewer people like in between venues moving around. So you don't see as many costumes. There's not as much people watching. So that's unfortunate, and we're hoping that it'll rebound now that things are easing up a little. I mean, they still have a mask mandate, which I appreciate. I still wear masks everywhere, particularly during the holiday season. Since it's so close to Christmas, there's always, the big COVID bump there. I don't want to talk about COVID too much, but I think there's some people that still stay away because of that. So hopefully as things sort of normalize and get in the future, people will start coming back because we just really love the show very much. But I wanted to talk about what we did see and what we did do, and show you a couple things that I bought, because there actually was some comic books there, which was a surprise to me. And then even more surprising is something I'll show you at the end that I think some of you are really going to dig, because I was really surprised to see it, and it's something neat. But that's a little teaser. First though, I want to, the art show is great. That's like where people who make art can sell their art, and so it's all this cool mixed media, lots of like castles and paintings of dragons with cats and wizards and all that sort of stuff. And there's some really, really cool art there. So I've had some of my art from my prints from like the Crime Busters and Cthulhu versus Uncle Sam in the show once before, and did pretty well. And I just keep missing, I keep forgetting that the deadline is way back in August, and I keep missing out. But in the future, I'm hoping to do more of that. And our show is always great. The game room, on one of the days we were there, we met up with some friends of ours, and I spent a good 2 hours with them playing Gloomhaven in the game room, and they have all these games, like dozens and dozens of board games there available for anyone that wants to use them. So you just come in, and they have all these tables, and so that was actually still quite full. All the tables were full of people playing different games, like the whole convention. That room's open 24 hours, so that was a lot of fun to do that. We'll say the vendor space is a lot smaller. Like the physical space is the same size, but there are only about half as many vendors as there used to be in the vendor room. So that was a little sad to see. Again, hopefully when we get more people coming back, there'll be more vendors coming back as well, because we always like to go through there. My wife in particular, like there's all these like bookstores and like used book people that have all these cool fantasy and science fiction books, but also just like all the interesting sort of stuff that people make, gaming stuff and cosplay stuff and comic book stuff. Like it's really cool to see all those vendors, and there's certain vendors that we see every time that it's always exciting to see, and some of them weren't there, so hopefully they'll come back as well. We can get some more people coming back, but we did still got some cool stuff and saw some cool stuff, so that was cool. There's a dance party that happens on Saturday night every time, where people go in costume and have a costume dance party. Have to say that was a little bit dead this year. They have the same DJ every time, and in the past it's been great, but for whatever reason, I don't know, it lasts for 6 hours, and maybe we were just there at the wrong time, but the block of songs we were there for didn't really make me want to dance, so we didn't stay too long, and that was a little flat. But I went to several panels. My wife and I, we always have different sort of tastes in panels, so there's a couple we went to together, but most of the time we're splitting up. She goes to her panel, I go to my panel, and part of the fun is we come back and then we tell each other about the panels and what we thought and stuff like that. So I was all about the comic track, so I went to mostly just panels about comic books. They do have several of them. It was unfortunate that there was no panels about comics on Friday, and then on Saturday there weren't any panels until 2:30, and then when we finally got the first comic panel, there were two of them scheduled at the same time. So that was a little frustrating. If that had been rescheduled a little bit, I would have gone to both of them, but I could only go to one or the other. So I went to a panel called Comics and the Women Who Loved Them, which was mostly about actually women creators in comics. I missed the beginning of it, but it seemed like they were going sort of chronologically through comics history to talk about different female creators and stuff like that. And that was an interesting panel. I also went to it was sort of a running joke that I was going to go to this panel. I ended up actually going to it. It was called Age and Fandom. It's like fandom after 50. Now that I'm 50 years old, I wanted to see what that was about. And, it was exactly kind of what I was expecting. It was a few like old men sort of talking about stuff they watched, cartoons that they liked in the 70s. So, I got what I was expecting there. Went to another panel. I'm just checking my checklist here, called Alternate History in Comics. That was interesting. One thing that I struggle with on the comic panels is when they're talking about, if they're talking about anything in comics that happened before the year 2000, I have a lot of opinions about things. I also know a fair amount about things, and so a lot of times in these panels, I really want to be on the panel because I get frustrated where I'm like, oh, they should be talking about this, or they're almost talking about this thing. And in here, it was very interesting because they were talking about what exactly they mean by alternate history in comics, because they had a couple different possible definitions. One definition being an alternate history of the comic book universe, as opposed to a comic book that's about an alternate history of our universe. And so they talked about examples of both. And what I really wanted to tell them to talk about, two things. I really wanted to talk about freedom fighters in the 70s, because is a perfect example of both of those things happening, where, they're telling an alternate history of the comic book universe, and an alternate history of the actual universe. And but in particular, I really wanted to talk about All-Star Squadron. You know, the thing for me was like, one thing they talked about was what they called alternate presents, which is like stories about that are taking place in the modern day, but have an alternate history of the modern day. And sometimes that happens because there are superheroes involved, and sometimes it's just the high concept, right? And it was interesting to me to think about All-Star Squadron, because All-Star Squadron is like, it started off as an alternate present, because what I mean is the DC universe, the superheroes during the Golden Age, there's all these characters and stories that are set obviously during World War II, because World War II is happening. That's what superheroes like had their big explosion of popularity, is because they were, you know, a fantasy for the people at home during the war, about what could you know, how the war could go differently if there were these superpower people on our side, right? But then, because that was so formative for comics, we keep returning to that, and so there's these stories that then become an alternate history of the comic book universe, where we're going back to tell stories about World War II taking place differently because something is happening differently with the superheroes. And All-Star Squadron is a super interesting like mix of all these things, because it's both, you know, it's written in the 80s about stuff that's happening in the 1940s and telling an alternate version of the Justice Society's history during the war. But because Roy Thomas is such a, not just a continuity nerd, but a history nerd, he's tying it explicitly to real events that happened during the war, specific battles, specific people, specific events in World War II, and then showing how those take place differently because they're superheroes. So anyway, they didn't talk about All-Star Squadron at all. They didn't talk about the Freedom Fighters. They talked about a lot of interesting things, don't get me wrong, but it was one of these things where I was like, oh, I really wanted to be on the panel so I could talk about all of this stuff. There's another panel I went to that was just called 60 Panels in 60 Minutes, where everyone in the audience writes down a panel idea, they put them all in a bowl, and then the audience, the panel members basically have 1 minute as they're pulling them out to just do a mini panel about it. It was a fun panel. It was a little too fun. There were some times where people had serious topics that seemed like they'd be really interesting for discussion. And sometimes they did get into a very brief, interesting discussion, but a lot of times they were just trying to think of the joke. And so the panel was fun, and it was good. It just wasn't exactly what I was hoping it would be, which again happens quite a bit. I put in a thing about romance comics, classic romance comics of the 60s and 70s, but unfortunately I had to leave the panel before they got to that. I was there for about half of the panel. I was hoping, since they were doing it at random, that mine would come up, but it didn't. So but that was still a really fun panel. A lot of fun and laughter, and the panel was absolutely packed. Again, even though attendance was down, it wasn't down at that panel. The room was completely full. And then the final panel I went to was the best one that I went to, which was it was called Insanity and Evil in Comics, and it was talking about how a lot of supervillains have mental health issues, or supervillains, basically how comics conflate mental health problems with evil, and how you almost never have, except for rare exceptions like Moon Knight or something, heroes that are the people with mental health. The people that have mental health problems are the villains. And then the flip side being, there are villains who have very good reasons in the comics for being villains, but they're labeled as being insane because of what they do. And so the topic was talking about how people use insanity sort of as a label to other people with issues or agendas that they don't like. So like if someone does something, you can basically label them as they must be crazy, so that you can then sort of discredit them or you can say like, well, you can distance yourself from them by saying, well, I would never do anything like that. I would never act like that. I would never make those decisions because they're crazy. And I'm not crazy. And so it allows people to sort of distance themselves. And they talked a lot about, again, a lot about it was in the context of superheroes. They're talking a lot about some superheroes that weren't, super villains that aren't crazy, like Lex Luthor. And then they talked about villains that are portrayed as being crazy, and like Harley Quinn, and sort of how they're treated by the fans and by the comics. And there was some really excellent discussion and debate in that panel. There was one panelist in particular who had some great points where they was talking about how well, he had a thesis that's talking about comics, and superhero comics is what he called a propaganda, basically propaganda where the people that are the minorities and the people that have like turned to crime because of circumstance are the bad guys, and it's sort of a power fantasy about showing that the authorities are the good people. So like the people in charge deserve to be in charge because they're good people and they're saving us from the bad people. And I'm not doing justice to what he was saying because it was really, really interesting, insightful, and well thought out. I wish there were videos of these panels, but they don't do that, so there's no way for anybody to watch them as far as I know. But it was really an excellent, thought-provoking panel. Definitely the best panel I went to of the show. Panels are always hit or miss. You know, there's always panels that aren't that great, and there are panels that are, you know, okay, and then there are panels that are great. You never know what you're going to get when you go in there. A lot of it has to do with who's moderating the panel, the preparation they do beforehand, that sort of thing. I was in one panel that I went to where they started the panel by asking the other panelists what they wanted to talk about and what they thought the panel was even about. And that was a little disconcerting for me, because I've actually been on an Arisia panel before, one year when it was virtual, and we had an email thread where we talked in advance. We worked out everything we were going to talk about so that we could research things and prepare notes and stuff like that. So when they go in there and they're just like, well, what are we talking about today? It ended up with a panel that wasn't as good as the ones like this that were clearly excellent. So a lot of really interesting, thought-provoking stuff about comics, which is exactly what I love. So my wife and I also cosplayed. The first day I was cosplaying as Crime Buster, who I usually cosplay as. I didn't have Squeaks. I have a stuffed monkey for Sidekick Squeaks, but I didn't bring Squeaks. But I had the rest of the costume. So Friday night, there was sort of a casual costume for that. On Saturday, my wife and I dressed as the sun and the moon. So my sun costume is not nearly as good as her moon costume. It's basically, look actually like Gentleman Ghost. It's an all-white, like suit tux sort of thing with tails and a white top hat and a white cane, which I left at home, but and then like a white sort of Phantom of the Opera mask. So it's like just an all-white. She has this wonderful moon goddess thing with a big crown, and she had like looked really cool. Then on Sunday we cosplayed as Dreamfinder and Figment. So I go as Dreamfinder, of course. I actually, since the masks were so required, I have a mask that has a red beard printed on it. So that really scared a couple people because it looks kind of freaky. But I was able to wear the beard over the masks as part of the costume. And I had a vintage Epcot bag and the top hat and stuff like that. And then my wife went as Figment, and she had actually made the big Figment tail, and she has these little fairy wings and horns and has the outfit and all looks like it. So people really like that. So that was a lot of fun. So I'm going to close by showing you a couple things. In the art show, I did not know this. This opens up a whole new door for me. I didn't know you could actually sell your comics in the art show, right? So the guest of honor in the art show, I forget what her name was. Wait, it's right on here. It's Winona Nelson. Winona Nelson, she's an artist that does a lot of Magic the Gathering cards. And so when I was going through her booth, she had some comics that she did. And I was like, you can sell comics here? in the art show at Arisia. So when next time I'm in the art show at Arisia, I'm definitely going to have some of my comics there. But she had a couple comics. I want to support artists. I bought them. So first of all, there's Unicron. There's Unicron, which is a short. I think it's only like, I don't know. I haven't read it yet, but I think it's like 12 pages. So it's small. It was only $5. I really like the design. Looks cool. And then this one was $10, which is about in line with indie self-published books. It's called Cut Flowers Chapter 1. And it's about, I haven't read it yet either, but it has something to do with ghosts and rock stars of the 80s. Down here, and you can see there's like a woman on fire here. And then there's a thing in the back here that says rock and roll, ghosts, sex, guitars. And I thought there was a missed opportunity there. Because, of course, you know, the famous saying, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Well, they've already got the thing that says sex, and we've got the rock and roll. And we have a thing that says ghosts. So I thought the tagline should be, instead of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, sex, ghosts, and rock and roll. Perfect tagline right there. But anyway, it's not my comic. But, you know, art looks really cool. And again, I haven't had a chance to read it, but I always like to support indie, self-published comic creators when I can. So I had to pick that up. And then finally, here's the big one, right? I talked about at the beginning. I was gobsmacked to see this. It was at a booth, someone that was making dice. So it had nothing to do with the rest of their booth. They had really cool dice, by the way, but it had a lot of gaming material. But apparently they're friends with the person who put this together. And so they had some on hand to try and sell for their friend. And here it is. Forgive me because I don't know how to pronounce this name. But I think it's Greem. Martin L. Greem's Comic Crusader Omnibus. Now, Comic Crusader was a fanzine back in the late 60s and into the 70s. So, and this omnibus has reprints of the whole series. So it started in 1968 and then ran till 1976 was the last issue, although really kind of ended in 74, and then there was one issue that came out 2 years later. But this is filled with articles and stuff. Here's an interview with Jim Steranko from 1968, articles, fan art, but then it starts like getting not just fan art. The pros actually start doing, pretty quickly, start doing strips in the book, in the fanzine itself. And so I'm trying to find like a good example of that. I mean, there's some fan strips here from Martin Greem, but then they start getting, hold on, give me a second, I can find it. Essentially, they start getting some pros that are doing work. Here we are, finally found it. They start printing. Ditko's Mr. A starts appearing in the book. And so there's all these Ditko strips in here. And then they start getting like, quote unquote, you know, the fan art, but they have like people like Steranko did a cover for the series. And all sorts of just like, you know, here's some art from Joe Sinnott. And trying to find some of the other cool stuff. Like, here's another Steranko piece. Which has, it's both Marvel and DC characters together. And it's just filled, like, here's Gray Morrow doing, like, I don't know, Flash Gordon, I guess. It's absolutely fantastic. And it's huge. I mean, it's an omnibus, right? It's gigantic. And it's a fantastic, like, snapshot of, like, the comics at the time, with all the interviews and the articles. But also it's just got, again, it's got like more Ditko Mr. A and more Steranko, little off color. I won't actually show that, but it's It's Wonder Woman taking her pants off for some reason. More Ditko stuff. They had some kind of, obviously some kind of line with Ditko to get that stuff. E-Man. Some cool stuff with like Magnus Robot Fighter. Just all sorts of like, you know, here's like a thing about Fourth World that has a bunch of art from Jack Kirby. It's just really like a fantastic sort of archive of things. Trying to see who the artist is on this. Frank McLaughlin. Some great stuff like this. Anyway, absolutely fantastic. Like here's Gil Kane. Trying to find out. The last issue has this fantastic Steranko cover that I'll show you, and then I'll wrap this up. There's an interview with Dick Sprang that has a bunch of Dick Sprang artwork. Oh, here we go. Check out this. It's Steranko doing the Man in Black called Fate. Check that out. That's from the last issue from 1976. How awesome is that, right? So anyway, absolutely fantastic. It was $25. Had to get it. Haven't had a chance to really read it yet. But it's just like, just filled with so much cool stuff. Just so many cool things in here. So can't wait to dive into that. Get a cocoa on some cold evening. There are plenty of those around here. Anyway, that's my long-winded Arisia report. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got a kick out of that omnibus. I don't know where that's available. I'm assuming you can get it somewhere online. But again, I just happened to stumble across it. So that's going right in my library of comic book stuff. So that's it for this time. Let me know what you think down below. And I'll see you next time.